Good morning, everyone. I am Jo Gilby, a partner in BDO and co-head of our non-exec director programme. I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar on corporate and organisational culture. We're very pleased to bring you this collaboration between BDO, NEDA, the Non-Executive Directors Association, and Telos, the consulting group. We're all passionate about the non-exec director community, and this will be the first of a series of webinars focusing on matters which are important to you. Please do raise questions throughout the session using the chat box. We are recording this. Our panelists will introduce themselves to you shortly, but I'm now going to hand over to Graham Durgan from NEDA, who will be our chair.
Jo, thanks very much indeed. And welcome to everybody who's joined us this morning on what looks, as I look out of my window here, is to be quite a grey day in the UK. We're honoured to have such kind of illustrious panellists joining us this morning. And we're going to be talking, just to recap, we're going to be talking under four areas: how culture impacts employee performance, how to create better awareness, how to understand why it matters, and really why we need to address the matter now. That's where we're coming from. So if I could just ask people to kind of go through themselves with a very quick introduction, starting with Ian.
Fantastic, thanks Graham. Good morning everyone. My name's Ian Bennington. I'm a partner at BDO. I lead our ethics and compliance team. I work very closely with Zsolt and Jo, and really helping clients to understand and to transform their organisational culture, and it's an area I'm really passionate about.
Ian, thank you. Zsolt, do you want to go next?
Absolutely. So good morning, everyone. Zsolt Seletsky. I lead the people advisory services at BDO, and I arrive with 30 years experience in looking at more the organizational behavior part of change, so cultural change in particular. Happy to be here.
Zsolt, that's excellent. Jo.
Hi, Joanna Boyson. I am a partner at Telos Partners, and we're in a strategic partnership with BDO to support their clients with the change that they're trying to create through cultural interventions. Telos has been working for over 23 years with senior leaders at an exec level and a board level to enable them to clarify the change that they're trying to create and share that with the rest of the organisation so it can be actioned. And culture, we'll come to a definition shortly, but culture is either a barrier or an enabler to that.
Jo, thanks very much. And Valerie.
Morning all. So my name's Valerie Hughesdaith. As an executive, my career was spent in HR, latterly at the BBC as Chief HR Officer. And I now do more portfolio work. So I am the chair of the board of the CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And I'm also a non-executive director at the Department of Work and Pensions.
Valerie, thank you very much. And just very quickly, I'm Graham Durgan. I'm the chair of the Non-Executive Directors Association, which we set up 20 years ago now. And it was formed to encourage diversity and quality in non-executive directors, and really to encourage more people to put themselves forward to be NEDs. We thought that at the time particularly it was a bit male, pale and stale, i.e. just like me. And what I'd like to do now is to move on and to ask Ian and Zsolt actually to start to address the idea about how culture impacts employee performance. So perhaps Ian and Zsolt, I can hand over to you.
Brilliant, thanks, Graham. So organisational culture is clearly a hugely hot topic at the moment. I'm sure you've all seen what seems like sort of daily headline news on organisations which are having issues in the press, which are having significant impacts on their organisations, their reputation and their business. But at the same time, organisations with strong cultures, which importantly are aligned to their purpose and their strategy, can thrive. And a strong organizational culture for me is and can be an organization's main source of competitive advantage. And a company's products, a company's services, to some extent, can be copied over time, but organizational culture cannot. So if you get it right, it really can be your true source of competitive advantage. I must admit, I have been struggling a little bit over the past few weeks in reconciling how these high-profile issues that organisations have been having can happen. I like to think that the vast majority of people are moral and ethical people, and I think there's sort of inner turmoil as to how these things can happen in organisations, and I think to me it's really linked to how we define culture. And if Katie don't mind just going on to the next slide. So we simply define culture as the way we do things around here, the way that we behave. And if there is an element of an organization's culture which is bordering on toxic, even people with high ethical standards and morals are more likely to engage in appropriate behavior. And that for me is kind of the explanation as to why these things are happening, why we're seeing these sort of daily headline news. And all the elements in these boxes on this page have a really big impact on an organization's culture. I think what's really important is that culture does need to align to an organization's strategy and purpose. All organizations are different and unique. So therefore, culture, there's no one-size-fits-all culture. Culture's got to be right for your business, your sector, your strategy, and your purpose. And that might sound painfully obvious, but it is surprising how often organisations aren't quite aligned on what their purpose is, let alone having the culture that they need to have in place to deliver it. And that is just of such high importance, because, as we say there at the bottom of the slide, culture impacts everything. It impacts business performance. It impacts employee retention and motivation. It impacts business resilience. So it's hugely important. That point there around culture being strongly influenced by leaders' actions and behaviours is I'm sure everybody on this call recognises is hugely important. It's really not what leaders say, it's what they do and how they behave that really sets the tone in the organisation, and the tone from middle management as well, where that can be as important as what the board and the senior leadership are saying about culture. That middle point on behaviours which are rewarded and tolerated, I think is a really, really big factor. If bad behaviours in particular are tolerated and not dealt with, they become more acceptable. They can become, if you're not careful, part of the fabric of the organisation. They can be part of the stories that shape what the culture is like in the organisation, and that can be very difficult to change. So tolerance, I think, is really important. And you've got that sort of classic example of where you might have a star sales performer who's absolutely smashing the sales targets, but isn't displaying the values and behaviours that you would expect of the organisation. What do you do? Because that then sets a very clear tone across the organisation. And then that last point around processes, working environment, and systems also have a really big impact on the culture. We do a lot of work with organisations, helping them to understand their culture, to understand where they've got cultural weaknesses that they need to address, cultural strengths that they can build on. And just before we go into a panel discussion, we thought we'd just share that with you very briefly, which is on the next slide page. So this is this is the model that we use when we're helping organisations to understand their culture. You'll see it split into two elements: fundamental elements on the right, and then distinctive choices on the left. And just very briefly, the fundamental elements on the right are really the things that all organisations want to be good at. So you can benchmark organisations on how effective they are on each of those elements. And then the elements on the left, the distinctive choices, are really choices, and that's where companies will need to make different choices depending on what sector they work in and how ambitious that they are and what their strategy is. But all of those choices have significant impacts on the culture. And it's important to recognise that you might make different choices, of course, in accordance with your different business units and your different geographies. But all of those elements have a really big impact on culture, and those need to be conscious choices. And that's the model that we work with to help companies to both understand their culture, but define what's the ideal culture for your organisation in the future. Just before we go into the panel discussion, Zolt, I think you were just going to say.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to give you not more than 3 points in terms of defining and making cultural transformation happen. One is cherry picking on Ian's point about fundamental elements and choices. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of taking a focus. If you really want to chase all these desirable cultural outcomes, it's almost a guarantee for failure. So I would say take a focus, something like between 1 to 4 elements of this model, and just try to promote that. So nowadays, I think we get engaged in a great deal of discussion about how to recession-proof your culture. So for instance, mostly actually we end up either reinforcing your purpose or actually increasing the amount of support that you can provide your people in tough, challenging environment, or on the distinctive choice side, innovation and agility are the usual suspects for strengthening when you are facing into economic headwinds. So again, focus, that's my first point. The second point is that you may want to ruthlessly translate these values into behaviors. And behaviors could be twofold. Either they are hindering behaviors, back to Ian's points, which are not tolerated. You can't do that and that because that has consequences. Or on the other side, very much desired or enabling norms. And let me give you an example of both, or actually, for instance, a shared mindset, a cultural norm could be that we, for instance, provide feedback because that's part of our innovation drive. But when it's translated into individually observable behaviors, how I provide quality feedback and how I'm behaving consistently, that's where the difference is made. So make sure that you don't leave it on a very conceptual high value level, but translate it to observable behaviors. And my last point is related to that: measure. And if you don't have a better idea, probably I would say the straightforward approach would be to define who are your key stakeholders and have a weighted opinion of those people if you don't have a better, more objective metrics. Well, after all, that's pretty much perception, what you have on stock exchange. So all in all, my 3 points: take good focus, develop your norms, and measure them. With that, back to the panel, or Graham, actually.
No, Zolt, thanks very much indeed. So Ian, what I think you're saying is that there's a really strong link to strategy, purpose, leaders matters. You've got the kind of no tolerance of poor employee behavior. You have to have a kind of the heritage kind of growing up through the organization. And that's helped by stories and shared beliefs, etc. And then you've got the impact on the system from it and to its systems and processes, etc. And then Zolt, as I understand it, you're saying focus. I mean, and be ruthless. I mean, this is not something you can just kind of skate over the surface of. And measure. Have I got that right, Zolt? Is that where we're coming from? Great, thanks. We've got some questions that have come in, and I'll just take a couple of them if that's okay. And this is for all the panel, not just for Ian and Zolt. There's a question: would you please expand on the choices around agility and risk appetite? Would you please expand on the choices around agility and risk appetite? Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, I can pick that up. I mean, yeah, so it's a great question. This relates to the distinctive choices on the left-hand side of the model, and the questions around agility and risk appetite are really how quickly do you want to move as an organisation, and how much risk are you going to take on? And clearly those are strategic choices, but they are strategic choices which have a huge impact on how the organisation operates and on the culture of the organisation. And yeah, clearly that'll be impacted by the type of organisation you are, the type of sector that you work in, and yeah, what your strategic objectives and choices are. But fundamentally, they need to be choices, and there needs to be clarity over that in order to everybody in the organisation to understand how quickly are we trying to move, how ambitious are we trying to be, what risks can we actually take, and clearly, yeah, if say you're a technology startup business or an oil and gas super major, those decisions are going to be very different, and they're going to make quite a different culture within the organisation. But it's important to recognise that those are choices, and the organisation needs to be clear on what the direction is.
And thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Okay, can I just think, there's another question. Don't you think D&I should be a thread throughout all the fundamental elements and not only related to fairness?
Well, I can pick this up. Actually, all of the factors would be very much overlapping with others. So you can't actually separate one or another. So I completely agree. D&I would have an impact on respect culture. So it's kind of a spider web. That's why we say if you are excellent in one or two areas, it's very likely that it will have impact on the others. So that's why coming back to the point of focus. But I agree. Yes, it's cutting through.
Great. Joe, do you want to add anything?
I will agree for now, because I would imagine we can pick up on this in further panel discussions. No,
absolutely. Okay, so let's move on then. And Joe, it's over to you, I think, actually. And we're really going to be talking about the how-to, the awareness, the language, the dialogue, the diagnostics, etc. Over to you.
Thank you. I want to sort of say up front that building awareness, shared language, healthy dialogue, the place of cultural diagnostics and transformation, they are not mutually exclusive points, but I do want to have a go at speaking to all elements and allowing the panel to as well. So forgive me if it looks like it sounds like they're all separate pieces, but there's nothing like to speak to the awareness and acknowledging our audience. There's nothing like a pain point to create that case for building awareness for culture. So on a rational front, boards are the highest level of accountability for making sure an organisation thrives. And the code of conduct, the governance code, Companies Act, they all reference, the importance of boards to pursue purpose and strategy and values with, not in that order, purpose, values and strategy with the senior leaders and the rest of the organisation. But what we find is we get called in often when there's a risk to reputation or survival of an organisation or an opportunity. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. So the point here is it speaks to strategy. You've got to make sure your case for culture is linking to what the organisation is trying to do, what they're trying to change. I'll just give you a couple of extreme examples. So we supported an insurance business. They lost their chief executive under a dark cloud. It was linked to bullying behaviour, and the regulators show interest. So, that's an important point for a board to get involved. And there we supported them to define what they believe is their desired culture. And to pick up on Zolt's points, we were able to articulate, because we were articulating it in behaviours, we were able to measure that, and we were able to support the board and the rest of the organisation to recover from that very difficult situation. On the opportunities side, we had a manufacturing business with a big presence in America and Asia, and they could see that their joint venture was just not going to cut it in the market unless they became customer-centric. And so that became that point, that case for culture was that point of, right, here's where we need to build that awareness. To to the shared language, Zolt has spoken quite eloquently on this. I think a lot of our organisations, everyone we're speaking to probably has a purpose statement. Ian said, worth unpacking. What do we mean by that purpose statement? Is it just words? Do we feel the passion when we're talking to it and defending it? And people will often have a set of values. But you've heard it all before in the papers and research documentation that often those are just words. So what we do is we support our clients to articulate that into a mindset. Okay, how do I look after the purpose and the values in the way I make decisions everywhere, in the way even the way I go into a conversation? Am I looking after the purpose and the values? And we also help our clients to articulate that into a set of behaviours. And the behaviours, they're quite pedantic, but they have to be, because they have to be information that somebody can look at and say, this person is doing that, or this person is not doing that. And therefore I have license to give feedback. I have license to support them to be better, but I can also measure it. And most typically in the people processes. So culture diagnostics can be really powerful in the context of the unifying culture model that you've just seen, you've had a glimpse of, really powerful for helping the senior leaders to articulate what it is they're trying to do with their culture. What bits are really healthy and what bits are not, but how does the culture link to what they're trying to do? What's the change they're trying to create? It's going to help their organization survive and eventually thrive. So really powerful for focus, as we've already heard, but they're also really powerful for stimulating the conversation, whether that's every 6 months or annually. It's this is how we're doing, and let's have a conversation about this. Not, oh, we're really bad, but what can we do about this? What are we really happy about? What can we celebrate? Because often we think about what we're not doing well, but actually if we acknowledge what we are doing and celebrate that, that can be a point of a place for momentum, a place for progressing. And the transformation comes with time. So we've recently had the privilege of working with a board and an exec in one room. We've been working with them for 4 years. Real transformation takes a long time. That group of people started arguing with each other, triggering each other, not hearing each other, not working together. How could the care organisation that they were leading do their best work if they were battling? And 4 years on with that, where culture was really helping them to build a shared language, they're now outstanding, and really enjoying their interactions again. A pause there.
Oh, thank you. And just to let everybody who's on the call know that we will be circulating slides, so you don't have to write frantically while you're listening. Okay, thanks. So we've got a couple of questions actually. One is which says 2 areas of focus. I try and get boards to focus on are 1, ethics. The board should have an ethical framework for decision, and 2, a speaking up policy. The board should ensure that there's a safe space for people to raise concerns. The concept about an ethical framework and a speaking up policy. Joe, do you want to talk to those? And Ian, I'll bring you in if I may on speaking up, because I know you feel strongly about that.
I think these are great examples of artifacts of culture. What you have to be careful of is you're not relying on a piece of paper or a policy or a framework that actually the organisation is empowered from that point. So I think it's really powerful, really important to formalise it, because you've got this backstop. It provides a licence. It provides that clarity of what we mean, because each organisation will have its, as we were seeing with the model, the culture model, there are going to be specific elements that an organisation wants to strive on, not everything. So it's really important that the organisation is able to articulate what it is that they're defending and protecting, but you got to see your people in the organisation, particularly the senior people in the organisation, following through on those words. That would be.
Yeah, so basically you're saying you've got to walk the talk. Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, just that point on speaking up is which I think was raised by David, it's a hugely important point, and there's been actually lots of studies which have shown that the best performing teams and groups and organisations are often the ones where they have this concept of psychological safety, where people feel able to share issues and voice concerns, and of course, what organisation would not want to know and understand about the challenges that people are facing? So those can be addressed. If they're not addressed, often it leads to poor performance, or at worst, people leaving the organisation. So promoting an open environment where people feel psychologically safe and have the ability to speak up and report concerns without fear of retribution, which is often the reason that people don't voice concerns, is hugely important. And people that do speak up should be rewarded and encouraged to do so, not the opposite, which is sometimes unfortunately the case. The oil and gas industry is a good one a good industry to learn from, following the Gulf of Mexico oil disaster that the BP had. I mean, they for example mandated speak up reporting, so they mandated the reporting of near misses. Everyone was required to report where things could have gone wrong, which is just a great way to embed a culture of openness and where people are used to speaking up and raising and sharing concerns. And I'm really passionate about that. I think it's really important. It should be definitely encouraged in all organisations.
Thank you. Valerie, do you want to add anything, or shall I just move to the next question?
I'm okay for you to move to the next question.
Okay, so the next question that came through actually was an important one, which is, how do you measure behaviour? I don't know, Zsolt, do you want to pick that up?
Absolutely, yes. First of all, it starts with a very precise definition. What is it that you'd like to see? And it's not like very conceptual, but actually, what is constructive feedback means? Or relating back to the previous question, if you think you'd like to see a speak-up culture, what does it mean in terms of behaviors? And I completely agree that you need policies, frameworks, but I think perhaps the most important factor is leadership behaviors. And if you can somehow measure, for instance, number of questions that you try to do before you make a decision. So, for instance, there was one organization I used to work with. They say, look, we don't actually take any decision until we get 2 or 3 major challenges, kind of testing questions. And that's a measurable thing. But there are other potential metrics. There are about 10 typical metrics that organizations use. I'm not going to go into that, but there is good research about what are the usual benchmarkable solutions. And some organizations like to benchmark it externally, but other organizations pretty much look at their own standards and say how they develop according to their own, definitions.
Can I add something to that?
Future.
Our bravest clients have taken away the typical competencies in the HR space and how they manage people, and they simply have 12 statements that's directly linked to their values working together, not one value, one set of behaviors, but they have a set of 12 statements that every single person in the organization, including the board, are using in their performance management process.
Yeah. Well,
I provide feedback to others. I ask questions. I find ways to turn ideas into reality. I influence others with very generic statements, but behaviorally based.
And Jo, do these always tend to be the same 12 statements?
No, because if we go back to some of the earlier points, your culture, I feel really strongly about this, your culture has to come from what you've got naturally in your organization. You can't you can't transfuse values like blood. So you have to understand what the organization has and what they need to amplify to be able to be the best version of themselves in line with their purpose and their strategy. And therefore, there will be behaviors that are similar from one organization to another, but they need to be tied to the values that the organization is striving to deliver on every day in every experience.
So you wanted to come in then?
Yes, focus. It's just about focus.
The best process I've seen on that is both a bottom-up and a top-down approach run simultaneously. So the board started decomposing their strategy into what are the important behaviors that the leadership team can support it. But also there was a bottom-up process involving all the people saying that what bothers you, what is it that can make your life easier or your identity better explained. And then with that sort of iteration, they agreed with a small number of shared behaviors, which is equally important in terms of delivering on strategy, but equally pragmatic in terms of making the people's life easier, more applicable, etc.
So that reminds me about when my daughter is now much older than this, started school at the age of 11, and she sat down with her teachers, and they all had to write down what they thought were important and how they were going to behave towards each other as school children. And then, but from the top, the teachers were clearly influencing as well. That's exactly what you're talking about, isn't it?
That's right. In a corporate environment, obviously, you need to organize that. But if you do that, you have a benefit of coming up with something which is owned by your people. It's not imposed on them. It's almost naturally coming out of their practice.
Absolutely. Ian, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I do. I do. And then just picking up on that point, I completely agree. The organisations that tend to be able to sustain an effective culture are often the ones where, it's not a board imposed culture, but clearly the leadership and the board have a key role in defining what the culture should be. But where the business and the organisation is engaged in defining that they bring the organisation along with them, and it feels like a much more holistic, interactive exercise. Just on the point on measuring behaviours, maybe just a bit of a sort of case study example might help. So where we're helping companies with understanding their culture, you've got to do it, I think, through a variety of mechanisms. And one is clearly speaking to the people who work in the organisation to understand those behaviours. One is a sort of detailed survey to benchmark and be able to extrapolate data to basically determine a score against each of the categories. But then one is also key review of data and documentation within the business to look at what that is telling us about the culture as well. So it's got to be a combination of all of those things.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Sorry, somebody was saying, Zsolt, was that you?
Yes. Can I share with you the most amazing experience I had with the board? They had a very vivid discussion about how much the people live their culture. And that was a very emotional discussion. At some point, their non-executive director actually suggested, why don't we stop the session now, go out and ask randomly 10 people on the corridors what they think about our cultures. So they just did that, literally. They went out for half an hour, came back, and asked the question, and how consistent their answer. I can tell you the answers were not consistent. So that convinced them that they need to do a little more focus and a little more communication, because they got actually an absolute bonanza on difference in terms of interpretation. But I thought that was so pragmatic, so brilliantly entrepreneurial that I can't help sharing that now.
Thanks very much, Zsolt. So where I'm at is that leadership matters. If we just want to take out some of the key messages, leadership matters, and actually you've got to walk the talk. I've got the concept that you have to focus. If you're going to really do this properly, you've got to focus, you've got to be ruthless, and you've got to measure. I think, Zsolt, those are the three key things that points you were making. Joe, you made a point that's kind of almost hidden, I thought, you were saying, is that this doesn't happen immediately. It takes time to change. And therefore, on that basis, I'll link across, if I may, to Valerie, who's going to talk about why boards have to do it kind of now, and a few other comments in that space. Over to you, Valerie.
Thanks very much, Graham. So I guess, I'd start off from the board perspective, why is it important? Well, first of all, from the board members themselves, they are effectively shadows of people are shadows of their leaders, aren't they? So if people don't see the board themselves behaving in accordance with the values, the culture that the organisation has determined, that's a massive problem. So, certainly this leading by example is critical. And as I think you said, good culture takes years to build but can be destroyed in hours. So, one board member behaving, acting in some way against or counter the culture can have a massive impact. So I think that's really important. And boards, when you invite people into boardrooms, a number of us will have, I'm sure, have witnessed that, where perhaps board behaviour isn't appropriate, isn't in accordance with the culture that's expected. That can have a phenomenal impact across the whole organisation. So it is important that the boards themselves practice what they preach and behave in the way that they want everybody else to behave. And I think one of the other things that worries me sometimes a little bit in boardrooms is sometimes a board member may have been out and about, which is great. Out and about, as was said earlier, testing the culture, talking to people, finding out on site visits what people are saying. But there is sometimes a little bit of a danger of anecdotes coming back, and individual anecdotes because somebody said X, Y, Z, suddenly steering the culture off in a different tangent, when actually that's just one individual and it's not representative of everything. I think as a board director, the sort of questions I would be looking to ask or checking, I think it's really important that organisations are responsible businesses these days, and it has definitely changed over the last few years for the good, for the positive. We talk a lot about ESG and we talk a lot about E and G, environment and governance, but the S part, the society part, as board members, I think we have a real duty to ensure our organisations are doing something that is net positively contributing to society. And that's making work and working lives better for all. And it's how the organisation's investing in skills, equality, well-being, fair pay, modern slavery, all those sorts of things. That's very much a part of our role. And of course, it's also important that culture is right, appropriate, and linked to the strategy, because of course, if you get the culture right, the productivity also goes with it. And I'm sure many of you will have read many of the Gallup surveys, which have some quite shocking statistics, where they say, for example, only about 9% of employees are enthused and come to work really positively wanting to do the best. 70% have come to work with a sort of so-so, not particularly engaged attitude. And we've got something like 21% that come to work actively disengaged and really disrupting effectively the organisation and its culture. And I think that's really important. So you have to think, what therefore should the organisation be doing to up the engagement levels in accordance with the culture? And every time you talk to people, and I've done this many, many times over the years, you tend to end up with the same things that are really important to employees, which are, a very clear purpose that has been very clearly articulated with a clear strategy, very clear, simple values, not reams and reams of paper that make it complicated. Simple values that people understand easily what it is that is expected of them, and that they can translate into their day-to-day work. So that's a really, really key one. And I think earlier Joanne was talking about behaviours and values. And my personal view is I'd rather just keep it to one, rather than having a set of values and a set of behaviours, but they need to be clear enough that people understand what's expected of the culture. But then it's things like, do they have career development opportunities? Are the reward practices fair? And most importantly of all, managers. Are managers acting, walking the talk, doing what we are saying we want from the organisation? And managers have a huge influence because they are the people that people see day by day. So if you haven't got the managers aligned to the values, to the culture, then I think you've got a real problem. So, for me, I would be asking a lot of questions in the boardroom about, have we got a very clear purpose statement that everybody can understand and understand their contribution to the purpose, the strategy and the values? Are those values embedded right across the organisation, not just a set of 5 or 6 words with a bit of paragraph under each, but are they truly embedded in the performance management framework, in the reward framework, the recognition, the recruitment practices, the promotion practices, right across the piece? Are they truly embedded? And are there things in place such as whistleblowing speak up mechanisms where if individuals do witness things that are not in accordance with those values, they can have a way to raise those? I think we nowadays have moved much more to having, rather than the old REMCO, Remuneration Committee and Nominations Committee, I think there's a real trend to moving to having what I'd call people, culture and remuneration committees. So allocating somebody at board level, one of the NEDs, to chair a committee that is broader than just the remuneration side of things, than just the senior people's pay. So more and more, and certainly in the organisations I work in, we talk at those committees about things, the performance management, the culture, the managers, all the things that are happening on the cultural side of things, rather than just the remuneration. And that in turn feeds into the board. So I would say, board should be having some sort of discussion around culture every 6 months. And that will be, finding out what are the blockers, what are the risks, what are the issues, but what's also being done about those. So to me, that is very important. And aligned with that is, that conversation that people were having a little bit earlier about measures and how do you measure culture and how do you measure all of this, which is incredibly difficult. But usually good practice, I would want to see some sort of dashboard of measures, which would comprise all sorts of different things. And it could be anything from the turnover rates, the absence rates, employee engagement surveys, things like pay gaps, gender pay gaps, ethnicity pay gaps, general diversity statistics, grievances, whistleblowing stats, promotion rates, Glassdoor ratings, exit interviews, all those sorts of things. I would expect some sort of comprehensive dashboard to be presented to me as a NED, to give some evidence and benchmarked, to give me some guidance and some evidence as to what's really going on inside the organisation. So I think all of those things, are very important. I'd come back to getting out and about, and as a board director, evidencing yourself, trying to find and asking those questions, as was mentioned earlier, about how do you describe the culture and how do you see the culture. It's important. And I think, one final point I would make is, with my role as chair of the CIPD, we've been doing a lot of work with the FRC, because if you take an annual report and accounts for any organisation, you'll find a very lengthy financial set of sections. You'll often find a very, very small, if any, people section. And we are very, very focused on working with the FRC on trying to come up with almost like, I suppose, a template of what should be in a really good people and culture section of an annual report for an organisation. Very, very few FTSE 100 companies today do have data that perhaps you would expect to see. So, for example, only 28% of the FTSE 100 had whistleblowing case numbers in their annual report and accounts. And that's very difficult for individuals, therefore, to understand what's going on in those organisations. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that area. And ultimately, that's what I would like to see, that, in all organisations, you've got a very, very clear alignment to the culture, but also, very clear ways of measuring, articulating and discussing how you're going to continue to develop it further in alignment with your strategy and mission or vision.
Valerie, thanks. Thank you very much. Jo, you want to chip in? I can tell.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm sorry, Graham. I don't know if I'm underlying what Valerie said or slightly disagreeing. Bear with me. All of the 100%, the more information that's being reported legitimizes, it just builds the visibility of culture is impacting on the potential of the organization. So some of those examples that Valerie was offering could be, for example, packaged as an employee lifetime value indicator, because we're in agreement that if you keep your talent and you develop the talent, that's going to be critical for you to deliver on your commercial results, right? Having a specific person or persons on the board that's looking after this, it's a little bit like the ethics framework question earlier. I'm going to try and pick up on a question that came from those who are part in this, that have joined this call. And it goes to that point about practicalities of how does a board practically pursue the culture. You have to be careful that you don't kind of make somebody else responsible for it. A board, if every single person in the board is not looking after how things are being done, every single thing, every decision that's being made, every bit of progress that's being made, if the board is not watching how it's being done, then you are missing out on an opportunity to progress potential or manage risk. It's very easy for a leadership team to hide stuff from a board. So you've got to be careful with the walkarounds, that the motivation is understood. The motivation is about enabling, nurturing, supporting, not checking up, because you can quickly turn into a situation where the board and the exec are like, fighting with each other.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Joanna, and I think it is really, really important that it isn't just the person who chairs a committee. Absolutely not. But I think it's really good practice to have somebody who has a particular focus, who is making sure some of those practicalities are happening. But absolutely, in the boardroom, you'd expect every board director to be asking the questions, as you make those critical business decisions, I don't know, acquisitions, it might be transformations, restructures, redundancies, whatever. How is that going to impact the culture? Every single one of the board members should be asking those questions and thinking.
Okay. So you want to add?
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to recap on one of the questions in the question panel by Melvina Etoche, asking actually what is the non-executive contribution, and I just sort of wanted to say, to me, the most important one thing is keep the ownership, keep the board ownership, make sure the board collectively owns that, and it's not sort of delegated. But there are 5 other things I think non-executives are well positioned to do. One is being the challenger, a disruptor. So asking the relevant questions, using your independence and sort of external view. Second thing is education. If you equip yourself with a little bit of insight, you might start to gently educate your fellow board members. Third thing would be focus, but also simplification, because usually culture is a very contextual, very broad item. If you can actually help simplifying that, both in terms of focus and metrics, that's a great service you can do to the board. Fourth things would be pretty much promoting this measurement with an external eye. I'm happy to say that 9 out of our 14 factors could be benchmarked against independent external data, and we are working on the rest of the 5. So these would be pretty much, I think, to me, education, challenge, focus, and external perspective together with the ownership. This is essentially describes what I think progressive non-executives can contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Very on a point of kind of just preciseness, you mentioned the role of REMCO and how you think a lot of this should be driven, a lot of the measurement, etc., should be driven through REMCO. Have I understood that correctly?
Yeah, what I'm saying is I think in many organisations now, remuneration committees have expanded. And in many cases, they've been renamed to this sort of people culture remuneration committee concept. So, it started off with REMCOs would deal with just the senior, very senior pay, executive level pay. But what I've been seeing more and more in organisations is that's expanded. First of all, it's expanded down with things like gender pay gaps and so on. It's expanded so those REMCOs started to ask more questions about the all staff pay and how things were structured across all employees. And then latterly it's expanded again, probably particularly with COVID and everything that's happened and the focus on well-being and employee support and so on. But certainly more and more it's expanding now to talk about the other people issues and the cultural issues. So it's a trend that I think we're seeing more and more, and hence, I then go back to then, organisations need to be able to articulate clearly to their shareholders and to all stakeholders what it is they're doing broadly in this space, not just focusing purely on the financial numbers and a bit of Remco, top level pay, and that's that.
Yeah. And I also, I went to buy a barbecue weekend, and I went to one of these kind of DIY places to buy it. And I had the most fabulous service. Everybody, somebody went and got me a trolley, somebody else went to show me where they were. It was just absolutely brilliant. And then I went to another branch of the same organisation later in the weekend, and it was absolutely ghastly. It was the most appalling thing. And I thought, well, and back to your point, I think it was about managers, how important the managers really matter here. And how you keep, that's right, you were saying that, weren't you?
Yeah, the managers are absolutely critical in any organisation. I think people say it's 70% of your experience every day is influenced by the manager that you have. And I don't think we do a good enough job with our managers. Everything from, first of all, clarifying what we expect of the managers. And I'll give an example at the BBC. We went through a big exercise of actually saying to the managers, work together, come up with what you think makes a great manager, aligned with our values. But, what do you think day to day that means in practice? So you could articulate it, because we're often not clear. We put people into these roles, but we don't explain quite what's involved. And the influence and impact they have on those teams. So, absolutely being clear what you're expecting, being very clear that you are promoting, appointing people who have the right values and the right attributes, as opposed to just the best technical person, and you need to move them up a layer. They really do need to care about organisations and the people in them. And be able to motivate them. And then, of course, what are you doing to help support those managers, whether that be developing them, increasing their skills and capabilities, through to just how do you communicate with them? How do you just let them know what's going on so they can cascade it down? But it's by far and away the biggest impact on any organisation is that cadre of managers and getting that right.
And to that point, Valerie, there was a question earlier about our view on the importance of organisations making sure that they are covering values and behaviours as part of people's induction to the organisation. And it's, yes, 100% agree, particularly because of that point that 70% of people's experience of a company is from their managers. So if you're not, and you should be thinking about in your recruitment as well. If your recruitment is too focused on technical capabilities and not cultural fit to the organisation, and then if you're not inducting people into the organisation and focusing very clearly on the values and expected behaviours of people, then how can you then hope that 70% impact is going to be effective and aligned with your cultural values and norms? So yes, hugely important.
Joe, I've got a question for you that's coming through here, which is, okay, so you end up with a really strong culture. Okay, how do you change it? Because it might work for now, but maybe it's not going to work for the future. How do you stay abreast of the need to have a transitional culture? Because effectively, that's what, in my experience, that's what good businesses do.
Without going into the specifics of a particular organisation, I would argue that there are some elements of the culture that will be timeless. So something like the unifying culture model invites some agility, some different focus for, okay, what does the culture need to respond to now? How do we need to react to the world? How do we need to respond to the world? How do we need to anticipate what markets are going to do next? I think, that I don't deny requires agility. But I think it's really hard to turn something from turn something from a caring kind of purpose to a pioneering kind of purpose. I'm not saying they're not the same thing, but just to try and give some examples, I think there's always going to be a thread of the organization which is almost timeless.
Yeah. So you've got a core, and then you're bolting things around it.
So that my question would be, well, what assumptions are we making that the culture needs to change? So if it's strong, healthy, strong, I'd be saying, right, what do you need to use now to respond to the market? If it's strong, not healthy, then you're still going to look for something in the organization that you can work with. Okay, we're going to work with that. We're going to focus on that, and now we're going to shift the direction of that effort. It's like fuel. Where are we going to turn the car now? So I wouldn't. Yeah, I stand to challenge.
I get it. As I understand it, you're saying there's a core element which is going to be necessary because that's the essence of the business, and you're taking that forward. And I think the point that you're making is that culture is the essence of the organization.
It is. So at Telos, we talk about we have to be curious, we have to be courageous, we have to be generous, we have to be collaborative. Now, if the world of consulting changes tomorrow, we will definitely have a debate about, okay, do we need to prioritize something else? But I'd imagine those 4 things would still be really important for us to have the confidence to change. Yeah.
Ian, I can see you itching to come in.
I completely agree with those points. There was a really interesting question that came up around, one of the issues that an organisation had recently, and whether the board should have been or were aware of that. And I think the key for me is that often around these sorts of issues that there are kind of unspoken truths that kind of people know are issues in the organisation but don't surface. And I think it is the board's responsibility to surface those. And the sort of ignorance is bliss approach is definitely not the right approach around these issues. You've got to tackle them, you've got to surface them, and you've got to deal with them. And I think otherwise there is a danger, as we have seen with lots of companies, where these issues have been left to grow into massive issues, which then cause big sort of reputational disasters. Okay. So
I've got one more question that's here, which I think is an important question, but we only got kind of 10 seconds each to say what the answer is. It's one of these quick fires. It's like Radio 4 and you're coming to the end of it. How do you avoid groupthink? How do you avoid groupthink? That's the key question. Valerie, do you want to go?
Well, I would say at the boardroom, it's by making sure you've got the right mix of board directors. So you've got people from very, very different, diverse backgrounds. And certainly as a chair of an organisation, I'm really, really careful to think when I'm appointing another non-exec director to think what it is I need that's different from the other ones I've got around the table. So to me, that's the way I would do it.
Great. Joe, Ian, Zsolt? Who'd like to go next? Joe.
And it picks up another question. I think you can identify board members that believe in the pursuit of a similar purpose. So you recruit on purpose and some alignment on values.
Great, yeah.
And still have the debate.
Definitely diversity and openness to challenge, I think is
great. And Zsolt, coming through to you.
Same point, but using ruthlessly data.
Great. So, ladies and gentlemen who've been listening in, I hope it's been instructive. Some of the key things that I've got out of it are obviously leadership matters. But to go back to Zsolt's challenge to us, actually, which is to be focused, to be ruthless, actually, not to accept poor behaviour. I think the point about the star salesman or salesperson is well made. And then to measure. I think I've got that coming through. And I picked up from Valerie what you were saying. There's lots of numbers in the annual accounts that we're talking about the pounds, shillings and pence, but the most important thing in any business is the people. And we're really not maybe measuring that, to Zsolt's point, soon enough. Can I just thank everybody for being on the call, the participants, those that have been listening in and contributing through the chats, and also to thank BDO for hosting